Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. The Sentinum, Third Samnite War. We just saw the previous episode at can't even pronounce. I'm gonna try. We just saw a previous Roman victory up north, and I believe this is gonna be more south. Glad you're here. Hit that like button. I appreciate you. Let's jump right in.
After years of bitter conflict between Rome and the Samnites, the climactic battle of the Third Samnite War was about to take place. Upon its outcome rested the fate of Italy.
It looks like these are 3 or 4 different factions fighting Rome. Rome obviously on the bottom.
Under the leadership of General Gaius Ignatius, the alliance of Samnites, Senonian Gauls, Etruscans and Umbrians arrayed upon the famous field of Sentinum. Across the field, consuls Decius and Fabius Maximus observed this sizable host.
A dual consul army. Okay.
They were clearly outnumbered. But then, according to legend, a galloping deer emerged onto the battlefield from the hillside forest, chased by a wolf.
Wolf represents... This is a legend. Wolf obviously represents like Romulus, Remus, as they were birthed from the wolf, or they fed from the wolf. I can't remember the story, but obviously the wolf represents Rome. I'm not sure if the deer represents anyone, but...
Amused by the spectacle, the Gallic contingent unleashed a few volleys of javelins and spears. Clearly, the two beasts alleviated some of the tension felt by the troops. The wolf ran to the side and away from danger, but the panicked deer turned towards the rain of projectiles. As it approached the Samnite battle line, it was slain by the troops from the Gallic contingent. Meanwhile, the Romans opened a way for the wolf to pass safely through their ranks, for the wolf was sacred to the god Mars. This was an occurrence of dire portent to their enemy. Encouraged by this sign...
And the Romans loved omens. Like, omens meant everything to them. We saw that when we were looking at the battles with Hannibal. Punic War, the Second Punic War. Omens really give morale.
The Romans advanced.
Confident.
But before we continue, I activate the location name or pertinence will publish. You get your. The consuls for the year 296 BC were Appius Claudius and Lucius Volumus. Appius was an ambitious politician who, as censor, had constructed the Appian Way, as well as Rome's first aqueduct. Volumus, nicknamed the Violent, had won a war against the Salentini, and while fearsome towards the enemy, was loved by Roman soldiers for his friendliness and generous distribution of plunder. With new armies in tow, Appius marched to Etruria with 22,000 troops, while Volumus commanded some 25,000 into Samnium, where he joined Fabius and Decius, who were retained in the field for 6 months as proconsuls. The 3 armies proceeded to devastate the lands of Samnium. Gaius Ignatius, the head of the Variani, a leading clan of the Samnites, understood that coping against 3 Roman armies was not possible. At a council meeting with other clans, it was decided that to achieve victory, they needed to cooperate closely with Rome's other enemies. And
yep, the enemy of your enemy. The enemy of our enemy is our friend, basically.
Divert Roman attention away from Samnium itself. Gaius was chosen to lead a major army beyond the frontiers. Commanders were further assigned to conduct a defensive war, whereby most of the remaining Samnite forces would be stationed behind the walls of their castles and strongholds. Seeking to join forces with the Etruscans, a people rich in money and manpower, Gaius's army marched north into Umbria. In Samnium, with no enemy army to oppose them, The Roman generals shifted their focus from ravaging the countryside to attacking walled positions, capturing several towns and cities over the coming months. Meanwhile, the Etruscans had mustered an army and joined the Samnites under Gellius. Umbrian tribes joined in, and attempts were made to hire Gauls as auxiliaries. This coalition inflicted several defeats on Appius, who lost the confidence of his troops. Realizing the need to spread out Rome's forces, Consul Volumus ordered Fabius to march into Lucania, where he was to stamp out a pro-Samnite faction from fully forming.
And we saw that in the last episode that Lucanites actually came to Rome because they were needing saving from the Samnites. I think that was in 298, 297, one of those 2 years. And that's how the initial Samnite War took off, because the Samnites wanted to basically ally. They didn't want to do that based off the deal, and then basically from there, Samnites got pretty angry at them, and invaded, or they did something. Did not go well.
Decius was to remain in Samnium, while Volumus himself marched to Appius's assistance. Appius resented receiving help from his colleague,
Right.
but under pressure from his own officers, he agreed to cooperate.
You need help.
Volumus challenged and engaged the Etruscans, and his reluctant colleague then followed suit, marching his army against the Samnites. The Samnites joined battle without waiting for Gellius, who was absent on a foraging expedition. The Roman armies drove back the enemy. Later in the battle, Gellius's cohorts arrived and briefly re-galvanized the coalition army. But the Romans eventually forced the enemy from the battlefield and captured their camps. The coalition lost 6,900 dead and 2,120 captured. Back south, a newly raised Samnite army crossed the border and began a campaign of devastation in Campania. Volumus hurried to Samnium, since the proconsulships of Fabius and Decius were about to expire. But upon learning of the raids in Campania, he diverted his army to intercept the Samnites. He caught up with them as they were crossing the Volturnus River.
6,000 Samnites dead. Wow. So it was a huge Roman victory here.
However, as the year 296 came to a close, fearful news reached the Romans of developments in the north.
Uh-oh.
Gellius's
Coalition.
defeat had led him to take his diplomatic efforts all the more seriously. He brought a powerful war band of Senonian Gauls into the field as mercenaries. Further Umbrian cities also joined the alliance. Now, a grand coalition of Samnites, Etruscans, Gauls, and Umbrians had mustered their forces in Umbria. This caused great alarm in Rome. At the start of 295 BC, Volumus was recalled to oversee the elections and advise on strategy. At his urging, the Centuriate Assembly elected Fabius as consul again, merely a year after he held office. Ignoring the drawing of lots in assigning the fields of command, the Senate and Assembly decreed that Fabius should command in the north against the Samnite coalition.
I guess that rule I stated earlier, I don't know if it was the previous episode or earlier in this episode, about having to wait 10 years for being able to be elected for consul was just whatever.
On the back of his successes against the Etruscans and Umbrians during the Second Samnite War. The Assembly also wished to re-elect the currently serving consul, Volumus, but this was near unprecedented. At any rate, Fabius prevented this, again requesting Decius as his colleague, citing their harmonious relationship. But just as Fabius marched out towards Etruria with reinforcements, news reached him that a legion under the command of Scipio at Camerinum had been nearly wiped out by the Senones. Meanwhile, Decius was assigned command in Samnium. 2 additional armies under Postumius Megellus and Fulvius Centumulus were posted west and north of Rome to protect against a possible attack on the city. The unprecedented number of armies and magistrates with Imperium operating in 296 and 295 was a novelty for the Romans, which reflects the threat posed by the coalition formed by the Samnites. Once in Etruria, Fabius took over the army of Appius near Clusium. Here he received reports of a much larger Samnite coalition force gathering in Umbria. Alarmed by the dangerous situation, Fabius requested that Decius join him with his legions. Volumus's command was extended for a year as proconsul, and he made his way to Samnium with the 2nd and 4th legions.
Okay, so they're basically taking each other's place.
This was to deter the Samnites from reinforcing Gellius, and to encourage Gellius to send troops back to Samnium.
Pick them up.
A Samnite army attempted to block Volumus at Mount Tifernus, but the proconsul drove their force onto the mountain and assaulted their position, defeating and routing the enemy, despite the difficulty of the terrain.
Pretty nice.
Meanwhile, in the north, Decius joined Fabius, and the 2 consuls marched their legions to the area around Sentinum.
Here we go.
Upon
Battle.
sighting the enemy army, Fabius and Decius were hesitant about advancing into the open plain. With the Samnite army nearly twice the size of their own, the 2 consuls had every reason to be concerned. However, they soon learned from 3 deserters that the experienced Samnites and Senones formed the front battle line. Their plan was to attack and pin down the Romans. Meanwhile, the Etruscans and Umbrians were to flank the Roman line and hit them in the rear.
All right, so they got a previous plan. I don't know if it's the same plan, but their plan before the deserters left, they have that intel now.
Wasting no time, the 2 consuls sent orders to the 2 smaller armies defending Rome, under Fulvius and Postumius, to march into Etruria and ravage the land as far as Clusium.
Maybe to try to break this up, or do it.
This had the desired effect. The Etruscan soldiers at Sentinum refused to allow their homes to be plundered, and they departed for Etruria, taking the Umbrians with them.
Wow, smart.
With half of the coalition force absent, Fabius and Decius sent their cavalry to harass the enemy, while advancing with the rest of the army into position. In an attempt to provoke them into giving battle, the Roman cavalry launched probing attacks, sweeping across the Samnite battle line and unleashing their javelins. However, Gellius remained on the slope above the battlefield and would not commit his troops forward. He decided to wait for his allies to return.
Rome, you can't wait. Rome, you gotta attack.
But after 2 days of skirmishing, officers and troops within his army urged action, frustrated that they had to endure harassment from the Roman cavalry. Finally, on the 3rd day, both armies decided to do battle. The Roman army consisted of 4 legions and an even larger number of allied and Latin troops, including 2 large cavalry contingents and 1,000 hand-picked Campanian horsemen, renowned for their combat riding abilities. All told, Rome fielded some 38,000 men at Sentinum.
Okay.
The size of the coalition army is unknown, but it is described as being very large. It included Samnite cohorts, Gallic warrior bands, Samnite and Gallic cavalry,
I mean, I'm gonna guess it's like 40,000.
and a force of Gallic chariots in the rear. Considering that about half of their host left the field, it is safe to assume that the Samnite coalition was around 40,000 strong.
So you guess.
Roman military doctrine was offensive, though on this day Fabius erred on the side of caution, aware of the combat effectiveness of Samnite and Gallic warriors. Fabius advanced the 1st and 3rd legions, but restrained his men from charging the enemy. Decius, on the other hand, wanted to force a quick victory. He assumed command of his cavalry and ordered the 5th and 6th legions to keep pace with the trotting horses. Once they closed the distance, the Roman left charged the Senones.
So you have a more conservative right, a more aggressive left, and then you have some reserve in the back right.
Knowing that the Gauls were themselves notorious for being aggressive in the opening clash, Decius urged the men to drive the enemy back, seeking to quickly take the wind out of them. Meanwhile, the Roman right came into contact with the Samnites. Fabius believed from experience that the Samnites, while vigorous in the initial clash, would wear themselves out over time, so he ordered his legionaries to take a defensive stance and draw out the conflict. All across the battlefield, a stubborn battle developed between the opposing infantry. However, impatient with the lack of progress, Decius personally led the charge of his cavalry against the Gallic horsemen. The Roman horse swept them aside, and retaining their momentum, they crashed into the second line of Gallic cavalry. The push continued, but Decius failed to see the advancing Gallic chariots that were charging towards his flank.
I didn't even know those were chariots.
Pressing his attack this far, the consul was now at risk of being cut off.
What are we doing over there? The reserve! Bring the reserve over!
The Roman cavalry on the left now came under heavy attack.
Oof.
Unaccustomed to the thunderous roar of chariot wheels, Roman horses became uncontrollable with fear. In a reckless panic, much of Decius's cavalry formation fell apart as the riders peeled off en masse and fled back towards the Roman side of the battlefield, with some crashing into their own infantry, throwing them into confusion.
Not looking good for Rome right now, especially on the more aggressive left.
The Senones now seized the initiative. Gallic cavalry and chariots attacked the left flank of Decius's infantry. The Gallic infantry, seeing the Romans lose morale, renewed their attacks, refusing to give the legionaries a moment to restore order. Decius tried to stop the fleeing men and rally the troops, but at this point his army was at risk of collapse. With a look of determination, Decius took it upon himself to restore morale through the ultimate sacrifice, the devotio, an act of ritualistic suicide in which a Roman general would fall to the enemy, dedicating his own life and the lives of his opponents to chthonic deities.
Now, does that mean I'm gonna fight in a suicide way? And when I say suicide way, like I'm gonna fight until I die, and I'm gonna go up insurmountable odds? Does that mean I'm just gonna let him kill me?
As the battle raged around him, Decius remembered his father who died in 340 BC by committing devotio during a battle against the Latins. Now,
common.
as his son who wore his father's military garb, Decius determined to follow in his footsteps. He had the pontiff Livius recite the words of the devotio and transferred his authority to the priest. The consul then turned his horse towards the enemy and uttered the following imprecation: "I carry before me terror and rout, and carnage and blood, and the wrath of all the gods, above and below. I will infect the standards, the armor, and the weapons of the enemy with dire and manifold death. And the place of my destruction shall witness the destruction of the Gauls and Samnites." With these words, Decius charged the Senones where their formation was most dense. Upon impact, he fell to a shower of missiles and swords. Witnessing this, Livius turned to the troops to advertise the consul's sacrifice, which inspired Decius's army to remain in the field.
So I guess a lot of this, of course, is to fight for your fallen general. And a lot of it, you have to know that it's happened. Because, oh, your general fell, oh, morale dropped. But if we know general fell because of this, morale goes up. It's an interesting thing. I've never heard of such.
But even more important was the cool-headed leadership of Fabius, who had sensibly kept reserves on standby under Scipio and Marcius. Although not yet aware of his colleague's death, Fabius could see that there was trouble on the left, and so he ordered half of the reserves to reinforce that part of the battle line. Seeing the approaching reserves brought new courage to the Roman left and forced the Senones onto the defensive. As the Senones formed a shield wall, legionaries gathered the javelins lying on the ground between the two forces and threw them at the enemy. Showing still more tactical preparedness, Fabius had avoided overcommitting his cavalry. While part of his cavalry cautiously skirmished with the Samnite horsemen, another part had been kept in reserve. Fabius could now see that his defensive approach wore down the enemy. The Samnites had exhausted themselves, while the Roman legionaries still had energy and were eager to attack. Fabius ordered his embattled cavalry in the front to renew their push against the mounted Samnites, and his infantry to press forward and steadily dislodge the enemy. Seeing that the Samnites now offered weak resistance, the consul gave the signal to his cavalry reserve to sweep around and strike the Samnite flank.
And I think this is what's going to do it.
While ordering his remaining infantry reserves to reinforce his front line. The Samnites found themselves hard-pressed by the general Roman advance. Exhausted, they routed. Maintaining momentum, Fabius directed the Principes of the Third Legion to turn and assault the left flank of the Gallic line.
Smart.
Finally, he activated the Campanian horse, sending them to ride behind the Senones and attack their rear.
So the right flank's routed, the left is still engaged, so there are about to be a lot more casualties on the left.
Despite being flanked from the north, the Gallic infantry resisted vigorously. But eventually they were overpowered and forced to retreat. The fleeing soldiers were cut down as they tried to reach the Samnite camp. Men clustered as they
My camp's getting burned.
approached the gates. Those who could not enter resolved to fight a last stand under the rampart. There they were cut down, among them General Gellius as well. Many Gallic fugitives were trampled by their fleeing comrades. By the end of the day, the Samnite camp was captured. The Battle of Sentinum was a particularly bloody affair. Decius and Gellius lay dead, and although only 1,700 of Fabius's men had been killed, Decius's army lost 7,000. However, the coalition's casualties were far worse,
Like a legion and a half.
with 25,000 killed and 8,000
That's insane.
captured.
8,000 captured, 25,000 quote-unquote killed. That means only 7,000 fled.
Fabius gave a funeral for Decius and burnt part of the spoils as a sacrifice to Jupiter Victor. The Roman victory was soon followed by further victories elsewhere. 5,000 Samnite fugitives attempted to escape through the lands of the Paeoline, but they were intercepted by a local force and lost 1,000 men. Fulvius defeated a combined force of Etruscans from Clusium and Perusia, killing more than 3,000 of the enemy and capturing as many as 20 standards. Entering Etruria as well, Fabius slew 4,500 Perusians and took 1,740 prisoners. Most importantly, Appius took command of Decius's army and effected a junction with Volumus in response to Samnite raids on the lands of the Aurunci and around the Volturnus. In the Stellate Plains, the two generals won a major victory against the Samnite forces, killing 16,300 and capturing 2,700.
The Romans are killing a bunch of people.
Through the strategic and tactical decisions of Fabius, the Romans had decisively defeated the coalition of 4 nations. The greatest threat yet posed to Rome's hegemony had been crushed. After such colossal efforts, the Romans would now settle for nothing less than the conquest of Samnium. The Samnites understood that their liberty was at stake, and they would fight on for another 5 years.
Wow.
But that is a story for another video.
Yes. That's it for today. Dang. I can't remember what that was called, but that suicide slash sacrifice of yourself as a general is just an interesting concept I haven't heard before, but I can see how it would boost morale as you are giving the ultimate sacrifice for your army, for the gods, etc. So crazy. But we can't forget about the tactical advantage they used by going to the Etruscans area and starting to raise those towns, which caused that army shrink just amazingly, almost by half, which allowed a rout to take place, and the conservative nature on the right side to keep the cavalry in reserve, to keep some more infantry in reserve, and then supply that to the left, and then run them around, and then use the companion horsemen at the very end to rout. Well done by Rome here. And I'm guessing Rome, of course, wants the rest of the Samnite region. And now there's going to be, we already know how this movie ends, but the Etruscans area, the Umbrians area, those places are now, those are tense places that can future fall as well, because they aided the Samnites. So I'll catch you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button. Peace out until next time.